Welcome to the second event of the 51st annual meeting of the Caribbean Development Bank, a webinar entitled Reimagining Caribbean Economies in the Wake of the COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Ian Durant, Director of the Economics Department at the CDB. In the next 2 hours, we will explore the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Caribbean countries, and more importantly, the policy imperatives for recovery and for building resilience to global shocks. Now, the webinar is comprised of 2 sections. In the first segment, we will examine the impact of the pandemic, beginning with a global overview, which will be provided by Nigel Chalk, Acting Director of the Western Hemisphere Department of the IMF. That will be followed by a regional perspective, which I will share. From there, we will zoom in on the situation in some of our borrowing member countries. And that's when we'll hear from Minister of Finance and the Public Service for Jamaica, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clarke, the Minister for Economic Affairs and Investment in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment in Barbados, the Honorable Marcia Cabell, the Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance in the Bahamas, the Honorable J. Kwesi Thompson, and the Minister of Finance, Economic Development, Physical Development, and Energy in Grenada, the Honorable Gregory Bowen. Let me now invite Mr. Nigel Chalk to start off our discussion. Nigel? Welcome to the second event of the 51st annual meeting of the Caribbean Development Bank, a webinar entitled Reimagining Caribbean Economies in the Wake of the COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Ian Durant, Director of the Economics Department at the CDB. In the next 2 hours, we will explore the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Caribbean countries, and more importantly, the policy imperatives for recovery and for building resilience to global shocks. The webinar is comprised of 2 sections. In the first segment, we will examine the impact of the pandemic, beginning with a global overview, which will be provided by Nigel Chalk, Acting Director of the Western Hemisphere Department of the IMF. That will be followed by a regional perspective, which I will share. From there, we will zoom in on the situation in some of our borrowing member countries. And that's when we'll hear from the Minister of Finance and the Public Service for Jamaica, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clarke, The Minister for Economic Affairs and Investment in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment in Barbados, the Honorable Marcia Cadell. The Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance in the Bahamas, the Honorable J. Kwesi Thompson. And the Minister of Finance, Economic Development, Physical Development and Energy in Grenada, the Honorable Gregory Bowen. Let me invite Mr. Nigel Chalk to start off our discussion. Nigel, over to you.
Thank you, Ian, for that introduction. Honourable Ministers, distinguished guests and friends, I'm delighted to be part of today's CDB Annual Meetings webinar. As many of you know, the IMF has worked very closely with the CDB in these challenging times, and our goals have been together to help our Caribbean members to overcome the COVID-19 crisis. To date, the IMF has provided emergency financing of around $1 billion to 8 Caribbean countries in response to the pandemic, and we are working hard to assist St. Vincent and the Grenadines to limit the economic impact of their recent volcanic eruption. In partnership with the broader international community, including the CDB, we will continue to support our member countries with financial support, technical assistance, and policy advice, so that they can come out of this crisis stronger and more resilient. Today, I'd just like to talk about 2 topics. First, what has been the general impact of the pandemic in the globe, and especially for the Caribbean countries? And second, what are the key imperatives now for recovery, and particularly for addressing the debt overhang that many countries are burdened with after the COVID crisis? As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has sent shockwaves throughout the global economy. According to our latest World Economic Outlook, the global economy contracted by 3.3% in 2020. Output losses were particularly large for countries that rely on tourism and commodity exports, and also for those with limited policy space to respond. Many of these countries enter the crisis in a precarious fiscal situation with less capacity to mount a major healthcare response or to support people's livelihoods. Moreover, we know that the youth, women, and workers with relatively low incomes and the informally employed have generally been hit the hardest. We know that income inequality will increase significantly as a result of this crisis. Furthermore, learning losses have been more severe in the low-income and developing countries, which have found it harder to cope with school closures, and especially for girls and for students from low-income households. Due to their small size and limited room for maneuver, tourism-dependent Caribbean economies were the most affected by the pandemic. Many in the region saw a GDP contraction of more than 10 percentage points in 2020, the deepest decline in half a century. Moreover, due to their greater sectoral exposure to the pandemic, economies that were reliant on tourism and those with large service sectors are projected to experience a much more persistent output loss and a slow recovery. Now that we've entered the reopening and recovery phase, the growth picture of the global economy is brighter. As people are adapting to new ways of working, vaccines are being administered, and policy support continues. The IMF has recently lifted its global forecast for 2021 to 6% and to 4.4% in 2022. This has been driven by unprecedented policy responses from countries, including a $16 trillion in global fiscal action and massive liquidity injections by central banks around the globe. However, we're concerned that the paths and the pace of the global recovery are diverging. While some advanced and emerging market economies are powering ahead, poorer countries are falling behind due to limited policy space and vaccine availability. Specifically, our growth forecast for the tourism-dependent Caribbean countries is only 1.4% in 2021. This projected slow recovery will mean that many countries will not see their economies return to their 2019 level of activity until at least 2024. The outlook for commodity exporters in the region is, however, much stronger, with growth projected to rise to around 6% in 2021. Of course, there's an unusual degree of uncertainty around these forecasts. On the one hand, the pent-up demand for international travel could be much stronger than what we currently project. However, slower than expected vaccination rollouts across the world may further delay the recovery process and cause more persistent economic scarring. So what are the policy responses and priorities for the Caribbean countries to avoid this long-term damage? First of all, protecting lives and livelihoods must remain the first priority. Spending on treatment, testing, contact tracing, and vaccine access is imperative to limit economic scarring. Given the logistical challenges and the lack of economies of scale at the national level, strong regional collaboration is key to ensure efficient vaccine access and distribution. Countries under near-term financing constraints will need to rationalize their non-essential spending and rely on concessional borrowing to support COVID-related spending. As the economy recovers, though, A careful rebalancing of macro policies is needed to ensure inclusive growth while safeguarding macro fiscal sustainability. This will mean well-calibrated and balanced revenue and expenditure measures to return the primary deficit to a lower level while minimizing the contractionary impact on growth. Efforts will be needed to mobilize concessional financing and build resilience against future shocks. Structural reforms are also needed to further strengthen competitiveness and raise long-run growth. For instance, to adapt to the post-pandemic international tourism market, a shift to more eco-sustainable tourism could be a possibility, with lower density, higher value added, and greater integration with local suppliers. Continued efforts to pursue technological innovation such as digitalization and fintech could improve efficiency and reduce cross-border transfer costs and facilitate international trade. Furthermore, regional integration, which has been an important and long-standing goal for Caribbean countries, would help the region build greater scale and stronger resilience against shocks. Finally, I'd just like to summarize a few initiatives under consideration of the fund that can enhance support to the region. First of all, the IMF is working on a proposal to make the case for a general allocation of special drawing rights equivalent to around $650 billion. Once approved, this allocation will address the long-term global need to supplement existing reserve assets. It will benefit all IMF members by boosting their reserves and will help instill global confidence while sending a powerful signal of a cooperative multilateral response. Members that are liquidity constrained would be able to use this allocation to smooth the needed adjustment and avoid distortionary policies, and it would provide scope for spending on crisis response and resiliency efforts. Now, allocations will be distributed according to each member's IMF quota share, but for the Caribbean countries, this allocation could be equivalent to around $2.4 billion in total. Countries with strong external positions would be encouraged to reallocate part of their holdings on a voluntary basis for the benefit of more vulnerable countries. This so-called SDR channeling. We are currently working on options to achieve this reallocation and seeking agreement with our executive board. In terms of timing, a formal executive board discussion on the proposal is scheduled for June 25th, and if approved by the board, it would be presented to the Board of Governors of the IMF. With an 85% majority voting, this allocation could become effective by the end of August. Second, the IMF is rethinking its approach to climate change to benefit its membership, particularly the small states. We're working to best support climate change adaptation and mitigation in collaboration with development partners, including the CDB. A coherent strategy is fully consistent with our mandates being considered for surveillance, capacity development, and lending. In this context, fund staff have been working with Dominica and Grenada in the region to prepare comprehensive disaster resilience strategies in collaboration with the World Bank. These strategies follow a three-pillar approach to analyzing the costs and benefits of building structural, financial, and social resilience against natural disasters. By internalizing resilience in macro-fiscal frameworks, we hope to identify financing needs, provide a roadmap for policy design, and also catalyze coordinated donor support. Our experience from the pilots have been very positive, and Dominican government's budget now incorporates disaster resilience strategy insights, and the IMF's emergency financing program for Dominica was also incorporating these aspects of climate change. Finally, and importantly for this region, we're working with members on debt-related issues. The average debt ratio in the Caribbean has increased from 70% of GDP in 2019 to 90% of GDP by 2020, and some countries have gone over 100% of GDP. This has been necessary due to the substantial policy response needed to counter COVID and the sharp contraction of nominal GDP. With a slow recovery in tourism and increasing public health needs, some Caribbean countries could face near-term financing pressures and debt sustainability challenges. We are working with these countries to engage on an advisory capacity or to offer fund-supported programs. These could help create near-term fiscal space to finance priority needs and also provide a medium-term anchor to restore growth and sustainability. We also hope such programs would catalyze external financing from the donor community. Finally, we've been deepening our work on state contingent debt instruments, which are important for this region. Recent analytical work in the ECCU regional consultation showed these instruments could be very beneficial for both debtors and creditors, given the risks of sovereign defaults following major natural disasters. We've seen the introduction of hurricane clauses in debt restructurings in Barbados and Grenada, which we feel will increase these countries' financial resilience. And we're working to increase the appeal of these instruments in the cases outside of debt restructuring. Finally, let me just reiterate that the IMF is here to support you in your efforts in whatever way we can, and we hope you have a fruitful discussion for the rest of this webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nigel. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on the region as a whole. Basically, the agenda that I have here is, first of all, I'm going to talk about the impact, and then I'm going to look at some underlying structural features that pretty much intensified the impact. I'm going to talk as well about what is necessary for a recovery from COVID, and then move on to a longer term perspective of building resilient economies. So the number of confirmed cases in the region total about 175,000. Most of those cases are in Jamaica and Trinidad. And tragically, there have been 3,680 deaths as a result of COVID. The key impact as it relates to the transmission to the economies of the region has really been through tourism. Pretty much tourism plummeted by mid-April. Between mid-April and mid-May, tourist arrivals were practically negligible. They've started to creep back up, but obviously we're not going to reach the levels that we saw in 2019. Merchandise trade was also affected as a result of supply chain bottlenecks and border closures. And what we saw is a 26% fall in regional imports and a 27% fall in imports. As a result of all of that, most of the countries in the Caribbean pretty much contracted. On average, the decline in 2020 was about 7.2%. The decline in GDP was about 7.2%, with about 13 countries experiencing double-digit declines. The only country that did not suffer a decline in GDP was Guyana, and that was as a result of the commencement of their oil production in Guyana. Nigel made reference to this. In essence, the primary balances deteriorated significantly in 2020, and as a result of this, indebtedness worsened. We had an increase from 9 countries with a debt to GDP ratio above 60% to 13 countries with a debt to GDP ratio above 60%. 60% being the sort of threshold above which debt has been found to impact negatively on GDP. Another one of the impacts was, well, there were significant impacts in the social sector. Unemployment increased, but we also saw an increase in poverty, increased inequalities, especially through the digital divide. And we also had higher youth unemployment and social exclusion. So let me move on very quickly to the underlying structural features that basically intensified the impact of the COVID pandemic on Caribbean countries. Caribbean economies are small, so producer and consumer goods have high import content, and they don't have reserve currencies. They're highly dependent on natural resource-based exports, whether it is their tourism assets or mineral deposits. And unfortunately, they're highly concentrated in those areas because of a low level of competitiveness. As a result of this, economies are subject to sudden stops when their main export industry is affected by a shock. And what we are showing in this slide is that many countries in the region have significant exposure to the tourism sector, with about 5 countries having a share of travel credits as a percentage of total exports of goods and services above 50%. What this has resulted in is really a sort of a significantly lengthy duration of recovery after a shock in most Caribbean countries. On average, the recovery in the region after the Great Recession was about 4 years. In other small states, the recovery was nearly immediate. Right? But you had some countries that took as long as 10 years. And in fact, there are some countries that never regained the level of income, the level of GDP that existed in 2008 after the Great Recession. And one of the things that we've noticed is that there is strong evidence that as export concentration, the higher is export concentration, the lower is growth. And that's a very important finding for us. It tells us that really, if we are going to increase growth, one of the things that we have to focus on is really addressing the issue of import concentration. The evidence also suggests that there's a positive relationship between volatility, output volatility, and export concentration. So export concentration is an issue that we really have to seek to address. And in fact, what the experience of Caribbean economies has also shown is that on average, our growth rate over the last 10 to 20 years has actually been lower than the average growth rate of other small states. And in fact, on average, between 2010 and 2019, the average rate of growth in borrowing member countries in the Caribbean was about 0.37% or about 0.4%, while the average rate of growth in other small states over that same period was 4%, so 10 times. And so that was just to illustrate that this is not an issue of size, but rather an issue of export concentration. So let me move on to the imperatives for recovering now from COVID. Ultimately, it's going to be very important that that the population is vaccinated in order to achieve community immunity. And there are about 12 countries among BMCs that have not reached yet the 30% vaccination level in the population. That's going to be very important for the recovery. The expectation is that tourist arrivals will start to increase, but a lot of that is subject to the extent to which countries can benefit from the restart of the tourism industry is really about vaccinations. The other thing is that we are anticipating that the level of the achievement of debt sustainability is going to be a slow process. What countries will need to do is to ensure that they focus on priority expenditures to contain expenditure, and as well make sure that they pursue optimality with respect to their revenue systems. If we are going to if countries are going to get back to that 60% level that we pretty much use to define debt sustainability. Let me just move on quickly to building resilient economies and the imperatives for that. Ultimately, over the longer term, if we're going to address the export concentration that we face, what we're going to have to do is to ensure that the economies are made more competitive. Making economies more competitive then facilitates diverse export growth, and that is the route to resilience and to significant sustained growth. And the imperatives really involve improving institutions and improving infrastructure. Pretty much, we're talking about improving governance, improving road infrastructure, logistics infrastructure. We're talking about improving public sector regulatory frameworks so that these frameworks are not as cumbersome on the private sector, and affecting cost. We're talking about improving business regulatory frameworks as well. We're talking about improving public finance management systems as well to make sure that the public sector is focused on achieving maximum bang for buck, and their adequate oversight systems, which generally would improve outcomes. We're talking about improving implementation to make sure that projects and so on are implemented expeditiously. But importantly as well, we're talking about exploiting the regional integration movement, ensuring that the integration movement, which basically provides a larger platform for trade, is capitalized on by countries. The cross-cutting issue with respect to this, obviously, is digital transformation. You're talking about making sure that public sector services are available online and so on, and education and training for this new economy, the fourth industrial revolution, and accelerating digital citizenship. So let me end it there. And what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to ask Minister Cadell to share with us the impact of COVID on the Barbadian economy. Minister Cadell, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. I want to say good morning to my distinguished fellow panelists. Ian, you've asked me to share a bit on the impact of COVID. You and I have worked together for a few years, and you would already know that, as we say in Barbados, I tend to be a little bit hard ears. I don't know how to talk about the impact of COVID without talking about the response. And so that's what I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes. Now, in terms of impact, let me just take 1 or 2 minutes to bear out, Ian, some of the things that you shared in your presentation. In Barbados, we saw an 18% contraction in our economy that obviously was led mainly by the declines in the tourism sector. Arrivals for the first 4 months of this year were at about 8,557. Arrivals for a similar period in 2020 were at 158,000. So that's about a 95% decline in arrivals. When it comes to employment, and Ian, unlike you, I don't consider employment in the social sector. It is firmly in the economic sector. But when it comes to employment, we saw that in the third quarter of 2020, unemployment stood at 17.9%. Those are unprecedented levels for Barbados. When we were able to reopen, to begin through our BEST program, our Barbados Employment Sustainability Program, which was focused on the tourism sector, we saw that there was a 13.6% unemployment number. So it improved from 17.9% in the third quarter of 2020 to the last quarter of 2020 being back, employment having recovered slightly, and it was at 13.6. Now, we saw as well that in the first quarter of this year, we had to have another pause in Barbados, and unemployment reached 17.2%. These are numbers that the region is not used to. This is a time that is unprecedented in every way. I want to turn quickly to what's happening with debt. Barbados restructured both domestic and external debt and brought it down to 118%. That figure climbed at the end of April 2021 to 148.2%. Now, what's happening there? Most of that, about just under, I would say, 26% of that has to do with the contraction in GDP. So as a ratio, that's what's happening there. Under 5% of that has to do with new borrowing that's related to COVID. And so when I come to the next short segment where I want to talk about the response, it means that we're going to have a conversation, a frank conversation about the global norms of public finance, how we measure the health of an economy. Because if I have a contraction in my GDP, such that my debt to GDP skyrockets, is it fair or does it make sense to continue to use debt to GDP to drive everything that we do and all our analysis? So let me come very quickly, and I just want to focus on 5 areas in terms of responding and building forward and building out more broadly for a resilient recovery. The first thing I want to say is that it's something that we tend to think is soft, but it has to be done. And that is that there have to be investments in skills, and total education reform in the Caribbean. This is something that we've been saying over and over, but the moment has arrived where there's no stepping back from it. In Barbados, we've partnered with Coursera to offer thousands of courses free of charge to Barbadians, because we realize that we're not going anywhere without a reskilling of the population. We've also had to focus some energy on this idea of micro-credentialing. A lot of young people are not going to university. While my government was pleased to be able to return to free tertiary education for Barbadians, and that's been important, and that's seen an increase in enrollment rates at UWI, there's a huge segment of the population that is not inclined, not motivated, not incentivized to go and sit at UWI, Ian and Nigel, like you and I did, and while away our time, getting certain qualifications. Micro-credentialing is the way of the future, because a lot of what is needed to drive the new economy does not require 3 and 4 year degrees. It requires a different kind of skill. So that's extremely important. We've also found that skills and financial literacy have to be embedded in the curriculum. We are now realizing that one of the reasons we're seeing such underinvestments in terms of people using their savings to invest actively is that a lot of people do not understand investment and how they can remove their savings from earning 0.01% in the bank and invest it in more productive things. And hopefully, one of the things that we'll see some investment in the region is growth and resilience bonds. If we are able to structure those kinds of instruments so that we can use local and regional savings to invest in development and resilience. So that's skills reform and education reform. The second one, both Nigel Chalk and Ian, you mentioned as well, and that has to do with modernization, including digitalization of the public sector and the private sector. Now, I want to say that the notion that it's only the public sector that needs to be better at doing business, let's address that frontally. What we found in Barbados, for example, with our banking system, we have a new national payment system. We had to have strong collaboration with the private banking system for that. And we both, government and the private banking system, had to get more flexible in terms of how we do business. And we've been able to meet great success with that. Our digital ID project, where Barbadians will be able to present one time to any government department and have a single identifier that can take them throughout government services, that's very important. And our modernization program, we see as one of the blocks to building forward in a more resilient way. Related to that is the third thing I wanted to speak about quickly, which has to do with predictability in the investment climate through our doing business reforms. We've placed quite a bit of energy, and my ministry has some responsibility for making sure that we are able to do a whole of government reform of doing business. I'll give you a very quick example. And our process is quite simple. It is really a first principles deconstruction and reconstruction of the process. It's not anything fancy. It's not necessarily buying swaths of new software, even though that might be indicated on some occasions. But sometimes what you need is just simple conversation. Why are we doing this? And how can we make it faster and better and have more value to the people who are using this service? And so, for example, in the energy sector, we've been able to sit and look at what does it take? We're seeing so many new applications, both in the planning and development side, so for town planning, and in terms of energy licenses, for people who want to get involved in solar PV, in wind, and other renewable energy technologies. How do we expedite the licensing? How do we expedite all of the regulatory approvals around that, around medicinal cannabis, and around all the new frontiers of the economy that we're targeting in our thrust for economic diversification? Economic diversification is not just going to come through new sectors. It is going to come through making the doing business environment better, so that you're not necessarily targeting sectors, but you're targeting any industry that wants to come to Barbados, or that Barbadians or people who live here want to get involved in. But there's scope for diversification as well we used to call it tourism sector. I like to call it the visitor economy, because a student like we have at Ross University or the other educational campuses that want to come here is really a long stay tourist, a very long stay tourist. So through medical and educational visitor projects where we offer educational services and medical services, we found that there are ways to diversify the visitor economy such that it is more resilient and such that we're not simply depending on short stay tourists over a high season, because that also contributes to the instability of employment in those sectors. So that's 3. I want to come very quickly to the idea of social protection reform. This pandemic has shown us something very important, and that's why I don't separate the economic and the social. They are clearly bound up together. We have a care economy that had to step in quickly to make up for what was lost in the public and private sector. And we've realized that the ways that we've structured social protection, what we call our welfare systems and so on, are not serving us in an urgent situation like COVID. And so that is something that has to take precedence. Finally, investments in climate resilient infrastructure are important, but those investments themselves have to be resiliently financed. We have made the case recently for Barbados-style natural disaster clauses in new issuances of debt. And we call for this not just in public debt, but also in privately issued instruments. Why is this important? Barbados is today the largest issuer of natural disaster clauses in the world. And what that means for us is that if there is a natural disaster event that's declared by some major international agency, that for 2 years, we do not have to meet our debt service obligations. This is extremely important. 75% of the world's poor are in middle and high income countries. So it means that the debt to GDP and the GDP way of figuring out which countries qualify for concessional finance does not serve us. Ian, you talked about countries identifying priority expenditures. Every expenditure post-COVID or in COVID is a priority expenditure. So we need to turn out to look at what's happening in the international system. We need to make sure that when we get to COP this year, we need to make sure that when we talk about the financing gap, that we are making it very clear that using the GDP approach to access to concessional funding is not going to work. If we are able to introduce natural disaster clauses in our lending, that frees up about $1 trillion in potential expenditure and investment in climate resilient infrastructure. So I want to stop there. I want to say that what is needed to build forward better is not just a business as usual scenario, because a lot of what we're saying we need to do, we've always said we need to do. We need to turn on its head a lot of the ideas and norms of global financial systems, and to really be able to come up with new reforms where they matter. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Minister Cadell, for those insights. I'm going to ask Dr. Clark now to share on the impact of the pandemic on Jamaica. Minister Clark, you need to unmute.
Let me go again. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Master of Ceremonies and Mr. Ian Cadell. Good morning to fellow presenters, fellow ministers of government from across the Caribbean, as well as to those who are watching your broadcast on YouTube or Facebook or other social media outlets. I just want to speak very briefly on the impact of COVID-19 on the Jamaican economy. The first thing to speak about is the impact on economic output. Economic output in 2020 declined by 10%, which was the worst economic decline on the history books in Jamaica. Other declines that we've experienced don't even come close. The next closest would have been in 1975 when the economy collapsed by 6% and so on. In the global financial crisis of 2009, which serves as some kind of comparison or recent comparison, the Jamaican economy declined by 3.2%. And yet still it took us 10 years to return to pre-global financial crisis levels of economic output. So you can understand the alarm, certainly with an economic decline of 10% of GDP for the calendar year 2020. Now, alongside that, in the recovery of the Jamaican economy coming out of the global financial crisis, the employed labor force grew by over 100,000 over the 4 years between 2016 and just before the pandemic. From about March 2016 to March 2020, 100,000 jobs were created in the Jamaican economy over 4 years. And it took only 4 months for 130,000 jobs to be lost, almost overnight. Now, the good news here, and in another segment we can talk about this some more, we have seen good job recovery so far. The unemployment rate went from 7.2% in January of 2020 to 13% by July of 2020, which reflected the loss of 130,000 jobs, and then recovered in September and in January, and now stands at just over 10%. So we went from 7% to 13%, we've recovered to 10%, and from all indications, that recovery continues to gain momentum. With respect to the impact on government revenues, we have had increases in government revenues over the past, over the 4 years prior to the pandemic, reflecting both nominal growth in GDP as well as inflation. And tax revenues peaked at $579 billion in 2019-20, and this dropped by 12% or over $70 billion to approximately 500. And these were provisional numbers for 2020-21. This presentation was done before the final numbers became available in the month after March 2021. But a drop of $70 billion to $509 billion, taking us back in nominal terms a few years. But if you're to adjust for inflation, this would have taken us back several years. So the impact on government revenues was severe and led to challenges of the kinds that Minister Cadell spoke to, and which I imagine were common across the Caribbean region. Yet, while we experienced this, a very interesting, I was tracking new company registrations from before the pandemic, and I was interested to continue to track them during the pandemic. And you'll see from this graph that, after a period of about 5 years of new company registration basically remaining flat at around the 2,000 level, so 2,000 new companies being incorporated each year, between 2015 and 2019, new company registrations almost doubled, growing at a rapid clip year on year, which reflected the improvements in the business environment. Very interestingly, that during the pandemic, in spite of what I shared here in terms of job losses, in spite of the record economic decline, new company registrations continued and actually outpaced the previous record. So we have the distinction of sharing that the number of new company registrations during the pandemic was the largest ever new company registrations in the history of Jamaica, which is quite counterintuitive, but reflects the confidence that Jamaicans have had and have that this too shall pass. And so persons have continued to make preparations for the post-pandemic era and for recoveries. And then we looked at business registrations as well, not just new company formations where you go to the company's office and you start a new company, but where you register a new company name. And again, the trends are similar, that, sort of flat, in the periods leading up to 2015, and thereafter a gradual increase or a noticeable increase in new business registrations. And then during the year of the pandemic, with the decline in GDP of record proportions and the loss of 130,000 jobs, the number of new business registrations was at a record high. And again, very counterintuitive and only explained by a forward-looking disposition, seeing or having the confidence that Jamaica's recovery from the pandemic, would justify the steps being taken to form new companies and to register new businesses, even in the midst of these economic storms. Now, speaking about economic storms, Jamaica is highly dependent on tourism, albeit not as dependent as some of our neighbors in the Caribbean. Nevertheless, tourism revenues, which constitute the largest source of foreign exchange for Jamaica, completely collapsed during the pandemic. The US dollars that we earned from tourism declined by 74% during the pandemic year when compared with the previous year. In the previous year, we earned just under 3.5 billion US dollars from tourism in gross receipts. And during the pandemic year, this fell to under $1 billion, a fall of approximately 2.5 billion US dollars. And only has comparison if you go back 30 years. So in other words, in 2020, we had the lowest inflows from tourism in 30 years. Now that 30-year period would have seen massive growth in tourism in Jamaica, with the build out of resorts and attractions and hotels, which meant that tourism output over this period that we're looking at, tourism output climbed, more than double. And, a shock like this in terms of foreign exchange inflows, Jamaica has not had on record. And by comparison, I've just highlighted the decline in tourism inflows for the global financial crisis, which was about 5% decline in tourism inflows. And you'll see from the graph that there was a quick recovery in terms of inflows, even though GDP did not follow. And in the 9/11 terrorist attack, which was more acute in terms of its impact on tourism inflows, inflows only declined by 14%. So when you compare what we experienced in 2020, a 74% decline in tourism inflows, it's just absolutely staggering. And the fact that we've been able to make it through, I don't think anyone would have thought, if you had asked a question a year, 2 years ago, could Jamaica withstand a 74% decline in foreign exchange inflow? I think the answer to the last person would have been no. And this indeed is quite an incredible statistic. And by the way, this is not unusual in the Caribbean space. I would probably submit that other Caribbean territories who are more dependent on tourism probably had larger declines in foreign exchange inflows than I'm sharing here. Yet, despite that large drop in foreign exchange inflows, our current account deficit was quite in order. Our current account deficit during the pandemic was just about 2% of GDP. And I believe the final numbers that have come out are at about 1.7%, negative 1.7% of GDP, quite in line with what we have been achieving over the past 5 years. And by comparison with the sort of pre-reform era where we had unsustainable current account deficits, and you go back to the period of 2008, 2009, during the global financial crisis, where current account deficits spoke of the difficulties ahead at the highly unsustainable levels in significant double digits. So the fact that we were able to, it's quite, to be able to go through a hit like that to the major source of foreign exchange and to come out at the other end with a current account deficit that's quite normal and quite modest. If I were to show this graph and I were to ask which year in this graph here showing current account deficits describes the COVID-19 pandemic, and I were to take the years out on the x-axis and showed it to class experts, I believe no one would pick the column on the right as the year of the pandemic, and this is indeed something that we're quite grateful for, and has served to underpin the confidence that, despite the record fall in GDP, economic recovery is around the corner. Now, it must be said that remittance inflows increased substantially during the pandemic, whereas inflows had been, tracking modest increases of 3, 4, 5% on an annual basis over the past decade. During the pandemic year, remittances increased by 23%, approximately $600 million US, which is the largest one-off increase in remittance inflows that Jamaica has experienced, based on the records that are available. And so that to be acknowledged, the diaspora responded in a record and dramatic fashion. Jamaica was able to maintain its sovereign credit rating during the crisis. And again, that's not something that one can take for granted. And certainly it's not over yet. And, so I'm just speaking here at the moment, right? So we've gone 15 or 16 months into this crisis, and Jamaica has so far retained its sovereign credit rating here with S&P, which, by the way, we went into the crisis with the highest credit rating in 20 years that Jamaica has had, and we have been able to maintain that credit rating despite the fact that there have been quite a number of downgrades in credit ratings around the Latin America and Caribbean space. We were also able to retain our credit rating as far as in the Fitch rating schedule. And the Fitch rating, again, we went into the crisis with the highest credit rating we had from Fitch in about 10 years. And we have been able to maintain that credit rating despite the downgrades that have accompanied credit ratings for other countries rated by Fitch in the Latin American and Caribbean space. Jamaica, as far as nominal debt is concerned, we were able to keep nominal debt flat during the pandemic year, plus or minus, just housekeeping sort of activities. But here we have nominal debt in Jamaican dollars in the blue line on top, and you can see that the nominal debt of Jamaica, remained in the $2.1, $2.2 trillion level throughout the crisis. And in fact, our external debt in nominal terms, in US dollar terms, actually declined during the crisis. And we've never been through any crisis before where we owe less in US dollars, or we owe less US dollars debt than we owed at the start of that crisis. And that is indeed something that is different from our historical experience. Now, despite this, and despite the fact that we've been able to hold nominal debt flat, our debt ratio, i.e. debt as a percentage of GDP, increased from 94% to 110% during the crisis on account of the 10% collapse in GDP. And it just shows how susceptible that particular metric is to output performance. That despite the fact that the nominal amount of money that we owe to the outside world, well, to the domestic lenders and to foreign lenders, despite the fact that that remained constant, our ratio shot up from 94 to 110%. So that, so just putting this crisis in context with other crises that Jamaica has faced, and in line with some of the comments that Ian made at the beginning of this session, it took Jamaica 14 years to recover from the economic storms of the 1970s, where in 1975 the economy declined by 6.5%, which until now was the highest level of economic contraction that Jamaica had ever experienced. And in real terms, we did not surpass the 1975 level of economic output until 1989, 14 years later. And you can see from this chart that the economic storms of 1975, because they occurred during a period of great macroeconomic instability, the economic decline continued in 1976, in 1977, in 1979, in 1980, before there was a period of recovery, only to be hit again by the alumina crisis in 1975, or the commodity shock in 1985 rather, and then to recover from that. Now, against this backdrop, and against the backdrop of the experience that we had in the global financial crisis, where the economy declined in 2008, but it didn't stop there. It declined again in 2009 and again in 2010. And it took us 10 years, or 11 years rather, to recover to the pre-global financial crisis level of economic output. And it's against this background that we have entered this crisis cognizant of our history and determined to do what we can, what is within our power, recognizing that there are several things beyond our control, to ensure that Jamaica has the best possible chance of not repeating this history, but establishing a new benchmark that we can absorb this crisis and recover in a very quick time. And recovery being measured by restoration of economic output to levels that were attained prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. The good news is that we are on our way, as the Planning Institute of Jamaica is forecasting that for the April to June quarter of this fiscal year, i.e. April 2021 to June 30th, 2021, that the Jamaican economy is likely to show growth of between 7% and 9%, which would be a deviation from our past experiences with economic crisis and would set us on a good road towards economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Clark, for your very informative intervention. The Jamaica experience with startups is certainly amazing, and I would argue that there are lessons there, lots of lessons there. You said that the increase was counterintuitive, and in fact, the evidence shows that business startups are in fact pro-cyclical. So this certainly says a lot about the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Jamaica, that it allows startups to be resilient in the face of recessions. Thanks for those remarks. I'm now going to ask Minister Thompson to please give us the view from the Bahamas. Minister Thompson, over to you.
If I was on mute, but I want to say a pleasant good morning to all of the fellow presenters all of the ministerial colleagues, to the moderator, and a pleasant good morning to all of the listeners and those who are watching virtually. Bring you greetings from the Bahamas. My presentation today is similar to my colleagues, which is navigating the crisis, the Bahamian perspective, and how we in the Bahamas were able to continue through these difficult times. And in listening to my fellow colleagues and in listening to the presenters, we see very, very similar themes. And as we go through the presentation, you'll see exactly what we are speaking about. But the first slide here speaks to the economic impact and the Bahamian economy before and after the pandemic. And we just use just a few key indicators with respect to tourism arrivals, unemployment, revenue, and then our debt to GDP ratio. And so we looked firstly at the tourism arrivals. And again, in a similar theme, we had during our fiscal period of 2018, 2019, we had very strong performance in our tourism sector. Tourism visitor arrivals increased year over year from in 2018 by 9.4% to where we had a total of 7.2 million visitors. And this was actually a historic year for us. And then we see a completely different picture during the pandemic in our fiscal period of 2020, 2021, where those numbers declined to where we only saw 204,677 passengers over a similar period. And that was over a 9-month period. And obviously that was a 96% decline, and for obvious reasons. Unemployment, in May of 2019, we saw unemployment stood at 9.5%. And for a number of years, we were trying to get below that 9.5, below that 10%. And this was, we were able in May of 2019 to see it below 10%. The estimates now during the 2020-2021 is that unemployment would have rose to an estimated 25%. And again, similar to other countries that would have had lockdowns. And as a result of those lockdowns, we would have seen unemployment skyrocket. With respect to our revenue, the government saw revenue during that 2018-2019 period estimated at $2.4 billion. And we saw a decrease of about 25% in our 2020-2021 period. And then with respect to our debt to GDP, again, we've seen a significant increase. We stood at 71%, and at year end 2018, 2019, and we saw an increase as a result of the pandemic to 82.8% during the 2020-2021 period. We then want to look at the social impact, really, and how this affected us from a public health standpoint, as well as some of the social effects of the crisis. Obviously, we saw a spike in demand from our health services due to the steep rise in COVID infections. And it really stretched the healthcare's capacity. We had to increase the number of facilities. We had to build new infectious disease wards. We had to rent additional facilities. And just to increase the capacity of the persons who required hospitalization. We saw a significant shortage in our medical staff. That was due to just the overworking of the existing staff, but also those staff members also have been infected as well and would have had to been quarantined as a result. Obviously, other countries, we are like other countries having difficulties in sourcing vaccines due to the high global demand for these vaccines. Other social effects of the crisis, the lockdowns and restrictions that we had to put in place really prevented many businesses from operating at full capacity, and that really led to a lower revenue and higher unemployment. As a result, many Bahamians were unable to service their debts, so we saw tremendous challenges with respect to mortgages, tremendous challenges with businesses meeting their debts, paying rent, and really providing the basic necessities for their families. We also saw an uptick in demand, obviously, for social assistance and specifically for income assistance and food assistance. During the height of the pandemic, we decided to focus on a number of initiatives to get us through the crisis. And this all was at the height of the crisis. We had 5 really targeted priority areas that we said we were going to focus on public expenditure. We had to strengthen our public health sector. So again, that meant quickly increasing the amount of facilities that we had available and strengthening those. It meant that we had to expand social support, and I'll speak a little bit about what we did with respect to expanding that social support. It was also about sustaining existing employment, and so we'll also speak to the expenditure that we pumped into the private sector just to sustain those levels of employment during the height of the crisis, and also some of the initiatives that we did with respect to strengthening the domestic economy and accelerating our government reform. And in particular, with respect to the government reform, during the crisis, we were able to pass some of the most significant financial legislation that dealt with fiscal responsibility. So we saw our Public Procurement Act that was passed. We saw a Public Financial Management Act that was passed, a Public Debt Management Act that was passed, and the Statistics Act that was passed. All historic government fiscal responsibility legislation due to strengthen really how we manage our government spending and getting really the bang for the buck when it comes to our government spending. Also, we saw during the crisis, in terms of responding to our health crisis, we had to put in place a comprehensive, like other countries, a comprehensive national vaccination strategy, which also complemented the Ministry of Health's strategy in terms of detection, treatment, and containment of the COVID-19 spread. We were able to procure 108 doses of the vaccine through the World Health Organization COVAX facility. And again, as was mentioned, we see this really for a country like ours that is dependent upon tourism, the vaccination and securing the amount of vaccines really is a key priority when it comes to opening up with respect to tourism. We've had targeted investments and financing arrangements to strengthen the public health infrastructure. So again, we took advantage of not just the financing with respect to maintaining the health facilities, but also in terms of using this as an opportunity to expand those health facilities. So we were able to secure funding in order to do one of the biggest renovations and expansions of our largest hospital in the Providence. But our situation is also unique in that we were in the midst of a recovery from the most devastating hurricane to ever hit the Bahamas, which was Hurricane Dorian. So we had to deal with COVID while we were still in the middle of recovering from Hurricane Dorian. So, for example, The second largest hospital that we have, that's on the island of Grand Bahama, was completely devastated as a result of Hurricane Dorian, and we had to continue our rebuilding and continue to manage COVID-19 during the two periods. So we were managing rebuilding the hospital, as well as managing how we deal with patients during COVID-19 as well. To date, when it comes to vaccinations, we have 56,292 persons who have received their first dose that have been administered throughout the country, and 17,827 people have been fully vaccinated. They've received their second dose. We've also had to support our small businesses, and this was hugely important for us. So through our Small Business Development Center, we have been able to provide $53 million in terms of loans, and what we call these business continuity loans. And these loans went specifically to help businesses through this COVID-19 period when they were closed down, when they didn't receive any income. These loans helped them to maintain themselves through this period. And then we saw where the government provided $44 million in tax credits, allowing persons to maintain 14,000 private sector employees. And so this tax credit, we were able to, instead of persons paying VAT, they were able to retain that and use that as a tax credit. And that, as long as it went towards paying payrolls in order to keep persons employed during the time, and that saved about 14,000 private sector employees. We also provided $171 million in direct support for unemployment and for income replacement. So we assisted persons who were laid off during that period, furloughed, and also those self-employed persons, particularly in the tourism industry, who didn't have an income. We provided them with assistance as well. Social support in the amount of $35.9 million went directly to assist persons with food assistance. One of the things that we really saw a huge jump in is with respect to innovation and digitization. We always had a track to continue this, but it was accelerated as a result of COVID-19. So we saw the introduction of a travel health visa, an online travel health visa, in order to facilitate persons to be able to enter the country. We created a program in the Bahamas called the BEATS program, which allowed persons to come into the country, work remotely in the Bahamas, and work remotely in other, from other countries as well. That we've seen a huge success with respect to that program. And then we've been able to launch what we call the My Gateway program platform, which really is a model after the Estonia platform, where all of our government agencies are able to be linked on one platform, and persons can go to one single window and access government services across a number of different agencies. We are at the beginning stage of that. So we've seen online, I believe we have about 20 online applications, and through this platform, we've introduced the e-cabinet, where ministers are able to access their cabinet papers and able to access cabinet meetings remotely, access them completely online. And also what this has caused us in terms of getting making decisions and getting those cabinet conclusions out, that really has been far more efficient by doing it through the electronic platform. We have now also accelerated our DigiPay cashless system, again, trying to make our government revenue more efficient. And so there are some agencies, we've started off with immigration, we're moving ahead with our customs to where they are now completely cashless. And we are now moving ahead also with our Sand Dollar, which is the digital currency of the Bahamas Central Bank. We saw also applications, e-passport, online applications where persons can go ahead and renew their passports online. And then this again was one that was very important for us, which we call the Promise Social Assistance Platform, where persons are able to access social assistance through an online platform as well. All of these were accelerated as a result of COVID-19. We've now seen the resumption of tourism. And so early indications is that because we've been able to open up, we've now seen an uptick. We've not to pre-pandemic levels. However, we've seen an increase. We're processing about 6,000 to 8,000 health visa applications every day. And as a result of our home porting, the cruise line home porting, we have Royal Caribbean that has started their home porting initiative, which we've now seen an additional 8,000 additional passengers every weekend. We've also seen starting to see an uptick in our revenue, again, as a result of us opening up, and as a result, we've seen some additional revenue inflows. We now started to move from restoration to economic growth. And so we have put in place some initiatives that is specifically targeted towards how do we accelerate our economic growth in the country. And we have decided on 7 pillars for this initiative. Obviously, first is targeting job creation. And so we've put in place a program which starts in July, where persons are going to be able to receive tax credits for every additional employee that they are able to hire, up to 10 additional employees. We've been focusing on small business development, so continuing that small business assistance. But in our family islands, we have designated those family islands as new tax-free zones, where in those areas, duty-free exemptions, VAT-free exemptions, again, incentivizing persons to not just have an economic growth, but to accelerate that economic growth. So if they have a business that they wanted to get started, we want to incentivize them to get it started now. We're focusing on healthcare, obviously, and vaccinations. We're focusing on innovating our tourism product. And that home porting, again, is extremely important for us. It is one of those things that it's an opportunity that has been provided to us as a result of COVID-19. And so we want to grab it, take advantage of that opportunity. We also want to begin to accelerate our foreign direct investment. And so we are revamping how we bring those foreign direct investments in and how we market ourselves to be able to attract even more. We spoke about the digitization and innovation, so we are just going to continue to press the gas with respect to that. But then we also have to strike the right balance when it comes to fiscal responsibility, because the debt levels that we saw last year and that we are going to continue to see this year really are unsustainable debt levels. And so we have to focus and have target expenditures, focus on economic growth, but then we also have to make sure that we focus on how we manage the debt that we have and put in place and execute the strategy when it comes to our debt management. Finally, the lessons learned that we want to share with you. First, a crisis can be a catalyst for innovation, and I would say innovation and growth. And there are opportunities that we saw through this crisis. And if we are able to take advantage of those opportunities, it then can accelerate us to move towards innovation and to move towards economic growth. And that really has been one of the things that we have seen. So home porting, digitization, a lot of these things we probably would have never moved ahead with as quickly as we did if it was not for this crisis. So there's always opportunity in crisis. And then obviously we must be prepared for the unexpected. Nobody ever believed that we would have seen some of the things that we saw in terms of tourism, a drop in terms of our losses, in terms of revenue, unemployment levels that we have seen. So we must begin to prepare for eventualities, even if these are things that we are not on our radar and that we would not expect. We've gotten a lot of losses. However, the attitude that we've taken is that all is not lost. And so we are taking advantage of the opportunities in the crisis, but we are also providing hope at this time for our people, because at this time, governments, I believe, are not just about the numbers, but they also have to provide that necessary hope and inspiration and motivation for its people. And that's also one of the things that we as a government have also been focused on. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you very much, Minister Thompson. There's certainly a strong demonstration of commitment in passing procurement legislation in the midst of a crisis, or maybe that's the best time. Also, it's good to hear of your digitalization efforts, very, very critical in improving efficiency. So now let us, we headed north. We started in the east, we headed north, and now let us come back to the east and hear from Minister Bowen of Grenada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and a very pleasant morning to my colleagues, my presenters, and all the others here present. Let me take a brief moment to commend the CDB for this forum. I mean, the information shared really sets the tone for us as countries in the region to look at what has been happening in our neighbors. We have done so mainly from the health standpoint because COVID has forced us to talk briefly about health, but the totality of the situation and the packages and all that's happening, it's fundamental. I think it will help guide us to make proper decision. In the absence of data, we can hear what our friends are doing. So let me briefly talk about the situation with COVID in Grenada. We had 161 cases, 1 death, but our health system has been stressed. While we did not have a significant amount of people who will go into hospitals and so forth, the process of managing COVID, the nurses having to work overtime, the doctors stressed, and the persons, the contact tracers who have been fundamental in securing the pace and the low rates in Grenada, I think they have all been stressed. The economic devastation is similar to what we have been hearing. Grenada's decline was 13.7% between 2019 and 2020. Tourism fell away by 73% with respect to tourism arrival. We have not computed as yet the exchange or the sums of money it have brought, but we know that their decline has also been significant because it's tourism and the associated hospitality industries, they account for 22%. But again, St. George University, which is critical, accounts for 24% of our GDP. That went again sort of flat. With nobody has yet returned from face-to-face classes in Grenada. We expect that to happen in August and September. So it is a component of tourism. And when you put the two together, you can see they are responsible for a significant component of the drop of 13.7% in our GDP as we shaved $500 million, right? $500 million or shaved off our GDP for a small state with GDP in the rates of just at 3.3 billion EC dollars. So we can see the significant effect of the pandemic has had on us. Our fiscal and debt situation really went out of whack. $110 million we collected less in just the local revenues. Grants and our intake from the CBI program went flat. So it is not only a $110 million reduction in financing, but we also lost over $150 million loss in the sense that we were not able to collect that from our usual CBI program. Our debt to GDP ratio jumped from the 57.1 to 69%, over 11% increase in our debt to GDP ratio, significant. Our social components, as we reported before, you can pick it up. We went from 14.4% unemployment in 2019 to over 28% in the third quarter of 2020. And I've heard figures of 17. It brings us the perspective of how devastating this has been on our employment. It's now down to 19.5%. So we have recovered, but we still have a very lengthy way to go. The negative and psychological effects can be seen from the response in the homes and how we have to look at, the anger management, which puts a big strain again on our social net and the people, the health people responsible for the psychological well-being of our nation. So all of those negatively impacted on our economy and our social life by COVID-19. The policies for recovery and the transformation. Now, since 2014 to 17, we embarked on a structural adjustment program. So the suite of legislation was passed. The procurement rules, the Public Finance Management Act, the Debt to GDP Debt Management Act, etc. But a fundamental act that we have passed and have stuck to is the fiscal responsibility legislation. In other words, we cannot go past certain metrics, limits that we have agreed with the international community, including the Caribbean Development Bank. And we have stuck to this under pressure from unions and other organizations. That is why we were able to enter COVID with some buffer, economic buffer, that help us to be able to pay the public service throughout. And even today, there was never a single period, a month, when the public servants did not receive their salaries. But what we had to do, use the escape clause in that same fiscal responsibility law, which says we have 1 year to remove from certain rules, like the 2% increase in primary expenditure, and that trajectory to reach 55% debt to GDP ratio. We went out of it anyway. And now we're seeing that we still have to borrow, so that 69% may be increased. But we could increase it this year. But as we enter next year, when we can no longer hold by the legislation itself, we can no longer remove those fiscal constraints, we have to start back again on the trajectory to get down to 55%. So even if it is absolutely necessary to get some financing as a loan, it will be extremely difficult. So that recovery process will be even more difficult for Grenada in this particular sense, that we borrowed from the IMF, yes, $22 million. We've borrowed from the World Bank. We have borrowed from the CDB. and that is what has increased our debt to GDP ratio. But the fiscal responsibility law will prohibit us raising the trajectory. So at least we have to be standard. We do not see ourselves going back to Parliament, going to engage the international community, including CDB, to ask us to remove that. Therein lies the difficulty, and we are not seeing it as a problem. We know that it is difficult, but it has worked for us in the past, 2014 to 17. So we could survive and even survive COVID. So we are planning to hold tightly to all these constraints so that we can even come out of the aftermath of COVID-19 in the same way that we came out after that economy, the world economy downturn that affected us so much from 2009 coming forward. So we have a three-pronged approach. The first approach is providing immediate relief for our people. And we have done the same thing that has been articulated by many countries before, providing direct support to people, unemployment support to the areas. We had $50 million in that context, plus $10 million through the National Insurance Scheme, in addition to what the scheme would be given to help in this particular area. Then we have a 2021 budget that stressed on the rebuilding and construction and followed by other areas so that we can bring the economy back on foot. We do have a temporary unemployment benefit, and over 6,000 persons benefited from all the relief. I said very similar to those who presented before me. On the recovery, we have to look at a situation where, yes, we are a tourist resilient country. And as I pointed out by Barbados, the SGU, the education tourism sector, is also very important. But in one stroke of the pen, COVID took both of them out. Our standard tourism and our expanded tourism. Therefore, we are looking at really utilizing our CBI program to really diversify. We cannot say we'll diversify away from tourism, but we will diversify to really take the conscious effort to bring in other sectors in, particularly the manufacturing sector. So how do we do that? If we look at our neighbors, Trinidad and Tobago, we see that the price of energy will allow them to be one of the biggest manufacturing countries in the region. We therefore must address our energy cost. Besides being renewable, saving our planet, we have to use renewable in a sense to reduce our energy costs so that our fledgling manufacturing sector, which may be 1 or 2%, it must reach, cannot be as high as tourism, but it must grow up. And over the next 10, 15 years, our plan is to get it to at least 10%. But we must start now, and we're preparing to do this for the timing. Vaccination is of critical importance. None of us will be out of the doldrums if we do not continue on that big drive to ensure that we get rid of COVID and its effects. We only have 9,000 persons who have been fully vaccinated, the double doses, because we're using the AstraZeneca, and just 19,000 persons who have taken the first dose. We have to get up to 70% of our population and 80% of our population, because all that we're doing here could be wiped out by a certain resurgence. And we have to invest in ensuring that that does not happen. We have been working as a team, Caribbean-wise, and I think we should continue to do so. And any one of us who fall behind and not give the importance to vaccination and getting our people out of it, I think as a neighbor, we should pull each other's out of it. So we have a lot of work to do in that particular area. The transformation, how do we get out of it? The digitalization is of critical importance. And fundamentally, we are embarked on a $70 million digitization program. The CARSIP, the CARDIP, the DG4R, the digitization of our courts and system program, the small states, small smart states, that's the UNIP project. We are already part into that as well. And digitization, again, all contemplated and foreseen before the pandemic, and that is the statistical data project financed by the World Bank. All of us operate as Central Statistical Office. But are we efficient? Are we making information decision based on information? Can we make a decision on information 1 month after? Most of us need a quarter to get the sort of statistics and data that we require. And this has shown us in the digital age, as we digitize, efficiency must be there. So even if we digitize, and we have to take a whole quarter to make a decision, we will be left behind in the digital world. So this is of critical importance to us, and we must continue. Yes, COVID has shown us the need, but as a region, as a world, we knew where we should have been going. And maybe we thank COVID for pushing us a little faster, but that should not deter us or say it's because of COVID we should do this. We know where we are going, and Grenada will continue to do so. Modern agriculture. We know one farm of the proper size could feed many of our small islands. What should we do now? We should move into the manufacturing program with agriculture behind us, because this is our indigenous raw product to move into this. So the technology, we'd move and support our tourism sector, not just simply the raw material. That does not help. Grenada, as you know, is high up in the world with respect to production of nutmeg and cocoa. But has it served us? It has not the way it should be. And we are moving into that particular area. The resilient tourism, training, and ensuring that our people can provide the services. We have partnered with Cornell to get a university on the hospitality arts in Grenada, backed by some of the larger hotels. And so we expect, therefore, while we are moving into manufacturing, we must make our tourism product even better. And so we expect now we will be able to attract more tourists to our country as we move on a tourism drive as well as a manufacturing drive. We are also focusing on building resilience on the several fronts of the environment, infrastructure, economic partnership, and that is vital. The three-pronged approach, coupled with what we had done before since 2014 to 17, which is standing us in extremely good stead, I think it's the way that Grenada has and will continue to move forward on. And I just simply want to repeat that this component or this arena area that we have been working on, it stood us in very good stead and will continue to do so. I think it was a moderator that I did not repeat many of the areas already articulated and clearly well done so by the speakers before me. And so I will end there for the time being and hope that whatever opportunity will be given to all of us, if any questions, I'll be able to elaborate on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister Boyne. Thank you for those insightful remarks. Now, that concludes the first segment of our webinar. I'd like to thank our speakers in this first segment, Mr. Nigel Chalk, Minister Nigel Clark, Minister Marsha Cadell, Minister Kwesi Thompson, and Minister Gregory Boyne. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to turn to our panel discussion, where we'll be looking at the policy imperatives for recovering from the impacts of the pandemic and building economies that are more resilient to shocks in the future. I know that we have sort of covered a little bit of this ground already, but I just want to give the opportunity to pretty much elaborate on some of the thoughts that might have been expressed in the during the remarks by ministers. And for this segment, we are again joined by Minister of Finance and the Public Service for Jamaica, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clarke. And we welcome Ali Mansour, Chairman of the Board of Directors at the Regional Multidisciplinary Center of Excellence, Senator Dawn Webby, CEO of the Grace Kennedy Group, based in Jamaica, and Mr. Timothy Antwine, Governor of the Central Bank, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. So, gentlemen, if you may, I want to begin by taking stock of where we are and what we have been doing to build economic resilience, and if we can extract some lessons. Ultimately, making our economies more competitive to facilitate high and diverse export growth really requires creating, if you like, an ecosystem that supports high productivity and low cost in the private sector, which is really about supportive institutional frameworks and good infrastructure. Now, having said that, Minister Clarke, I know that the government of Jamaica has been systematically taking steps to improve the competitiveness of the Jamaican economy in recent years. I'd like you to share with us some of the things that you've been doing.
Okay, thank you for that, Ian. So, I mean, Jamaica has taken steps to entrench macroeconomic stability as a prerequisite for economic growth. We know that macroeconomic stability is not sufficient, but it certainly is necessary. And so Jamaica has been engaged in deep structural, fiscal and monetary reforms in order to ensure that we can achieve low and stable inflation, a sustainable debt trajectory, adequate foreign exchange reserves, and financial sector stability. Some of those reforms include on the monetary side, modernizing our central bank, capitalizing the central bank, or recapitalizing it, making it independent, strengthening its governance arrangements and rules, and deepening accountability and the transparency of the decision-making process at the central bank. We've also strengthened our sort of fiscal apparatus with the implementation of a fiscal rule. We have put our debt on a decidedly downward trajectory, at least pre-COVID, in terms of the debt ratio. And that has come with, privatization of state-owned enterprises, as well as, other measures to ensure that our trajectory remains, revenue enhancements and tax administration reform. We've also implemented a, disaster risk financing framework where we have a multi-layer strategy to approach risk. Risk is endemic in the region, natural disaster risk, and we have a multi-layer strategy consisting of a natural disaster fund and contingency arrangements, such as a contingency credit claims with the IDB. We have a CRIF facility at another layer, and of course the pursuit of a catastrophe bond at the higher level of exposure. So disaster risk financing is a key part of our reform, and that came in handy during the pandemic as well. We've also been engaged in just reforming the public sector with mergers. We had over 180 state-owned enterprises, or public bodies rather, back in 2016. By 2020, those were reduced from 180 to just under 140. So we had lots of mergers, rationalizations, in some cases closures of public bodies to make the apparatus of the state manageable. On the side of improving competitiveness directly, We have been engaged in administrative reform, reform of regulations and procedures. We have slashed some of the fees involved in the export of items and export of commodities. We abolished a set of taxes that attack transactions. We abolished the transaction taxes to do with the transfer of real estate, and that has led to a boom in construction in Jamaica over the past 2 years, and particularly through the pandemic. The construction has grew by 12% in the last quarter, despite the pandemic, and in large part that's due to the policies that the government has pursued in modernizing the central bank, moving the policy rate to the overnight rate, moving away from exchange rate targeting to inflation targeting, which allowed for interest rates to be reduced dramatically to record lows. The policy rate is 0.5%. And that, combined with the abolishment of these real estate taxes, has led to a boom in construction of office complexes, of residential towers, and of hotels and other types of construction. There are more cranes, on one street in Kingston than would have been in the entirety of Kingston, in a whole year, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We have also eliminated taxes that act as an impediment to entrepreneurialism. There was a minimum business tax that existed that affected firms regardless of their state of development or their revenue base, and we eliminated that entirely. There's an asset tax that applied to non-financial businesses, which tax businesses on their assets without regard to whether they're profitable or not. We eliminated that and abolished it. And in 2021, we took a look at some of the taxes that affect exports of goods, and we had a customs user fee that applied to a flat dollar fee that applied to exports regardless of the value of the exports. And we've seen a growth in online commerce with export of items from Jamaica, sometimes low-valued items, of the 40,000 items or 40,000 goods declarations in 2019. 22,000 of those good declarations were under $500 and 10,000 were under $100. Yet the government was collecting a fee of approximately $25 for every export declaration, which made no sense. We abolished the customer's user fee as a result of that, abolished the customer user fee for exports that were less than $500, and we slashed by half the fee that the regulatory agencies involved in the export of commodities would levy on exporters of those items. We've also sought to address the financing that's available to MSMEs by building out a private equity and venture capital ecosystem. We will have a private equity fund dedicated to MSMEs that's likely to be launched this year, and the government has provided seed financing for a further 2 venture capital or private equity funds targeted at MSMEs to be launched in Jamaica. We would have changed or upgraded the investment regulations regarding pension funds and insurance companies, which allowed for their participation in this kind of growth capital. And those restrictions were lifted to allow just for a small participation in aggregate, and that has unleashed an ecosystem in Jamaica of capital that's deepened our capital markets, allowing for private credit alternatives and private equity alternatives that allows for entrepreneurialism to thrive. We're in the midst of repealing and replacing our Customs Act. That's an act that was originally passed in about 1945, I believe, and it has been amended since, but it is the core of the act is based on outdated systems and of production and of commerce. And the new Customs Act is before a joint select committee of Parliament, and when it's completed, it will be consistent with today's environment for production and for logistics, where items can move inter-country from one port to another port, to an airport, to a seaport, can be worked on and can leave again. And that modernization effort is a big part, or will be a big part of our productivity sort of increases going forward. We are working on improving the productivity of capital by investing in infrastructure and by connecting the country. In my budget presentation, I would have outlined the vision to ensure that our two cities are connected eventually by a 4-lane highway, that our two airports are connected, that our two ports, or our two major cities are connected by a 4-lane highway, and our two major ports and our two major airports are connected by a 4-lane highway. And so we will be catalyzing the continued improvement in infrastructure to boost the productivity of capital and to make the environment for investment more fertile.
Thank you very much, Minister Clark. Extremely exciting stuff going on in Jamaica. Especially happy to hear about how you are improving the entrepreneurial ecosystem and venture capital ecosystem more.
If I may just mention one more thing, if that on the risk of saying too much, but we're also engaged. Probably the most important thing in a digital transformation of the economy, and our digital strategy cuts across government and has many elements. One of the most important elements is a national identification system, and the law for that is making its way through Parliament and will lead to every person in Jamaica having a national ID with biometric authenticity, which will sort of underpin a number of services that will then be possible. We're pursuing a central bank digital currency, which will deepen financial inclusion in Jamaica, where all persons, even the vendors on the street, will be able to engage in financial transactions using their mobile phone or other instrument to store and exchange central bank digital currency. We're going to amend the Bank of Jamaica Act to give the central bank the exclusive authority to issue central bank digital currency, and it will be exchangeable on a one-for-one basis with the current, physical Jamaican currency. The third element, or third plank of our digitization strategy, is we're working. The Minister of Science, Energy and Technology has announced an initiative to build a national broadband network in Jamaica using a PPP modality. That work is underway, and we expect it to bear fruit over the years to come, and will be a key part of our digitization strategy. And then the government is incentivizing MSMEs to digitize their businesses, to procure online e-commerce suites, have a digital front end, by providing the financing for this acquisition up to $1 million Jamaican dollars, which is about $8,000 US, a quarter of which would be a grant, and the remainder would be a low interest loan. And the government has pre-selected vendors, over 25 vendors with approved products that can lead to that conversion. So we're pursuing this multi-variable digitization strategy at the level of digital IDs, digital currency, national broadband network, which will allow the persons who provide digital services, mobile and cable and so forth, to reach more customers at a lower price, and also incentivizing MSMEs to embrace the digital world and to convert their businesses.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Minister Clark. Very exciting stuff, and also very instructive. Now, if I may turn to Governor Antoine. Governor, in your opening remarks at the ECCB's 4th Growth and Resilience Dialogue in February 2020, you asserted that we cannot change our history, we cannot change our geography, but we can certainly collectively change our current trajectory. What do you see as some of the key policy priorities for recovery from the impacts of the pandemic, building resilience and enhancing competitiveness of the ECCU countries to compete globally in a post-COVID world?
Thank you, Ian, and thanks for having me. I appreciate this opportunity. The phrase that you referred to is something of a mantra around our central bank. I say it so often that my colleagues repeat it and tell it to me as well, which means that they've bought in. Just before I touch some key priorities, I think there are three essential ingredients for our region at this time. The first is a growth mindset. A growth mindset essentially reframes problems as opportunities. And that is how we have to think about COVID and all the difficulties presented by COVID. These are real opportunities. And with that, it's not just a sense of opportunity, but an injection of urgency to begin to address these opportunities. So when Minister Bowen spoke about some of the things that we were threatening to do with COVID that we are now doing, that's perhaps being opportunistic, but also recognizing the moment and seizing the moment. And we just heard from Minister Clark with some of the things in terms of. So the mindset. Secondly, the technology. Technology is a great equalizer. It is the one thing that positions our small states to have a fighting chance to compete in the global economy. And it is absolutely critical. So when I talk about history and geography and where we live or vulnerabilities, technology changes the game for us and gives us a chance to really go after niche markets in export markets and to compete. And that is something that we have to be very, very mindful of. And stop the nonsense argument we hear sometimes about we choosing technology over agriculture. It's an enabler for all sectors, economic, social, real sectors. And that's the mindset that we need to have. And then the third ingredient is collective action. We know our best shot as a region is when we take collective action. I admire what the countries are doing. Some of it obviously are nationally focused as they ought to be. But there are some things that are best done regionally. That certainly used to be the case for cricket. It certainly is the case for our central bank now, the ECCB. And it is the case for COVID in terms of the response of our region to addressing the issue of access to vaccines, that difficult issue, that vexing issue, among other things. Now, what are some of our key priorities? And I'm going to hit those very quickly because I'm mindful of our time constraints. Fiscal resilience frameworks. Mr. Clark made the point. They are necessary, though not sufficient. And yes, this is not the time we want to talk about fiscal consolidation. But as Minister Bowen rightly pointed out, we have to be mindful of this even in this period. And for the tourism-dependent economies, as these economies recover, whether that is 2023, 2024, we're going to have to pivot to fiscal consolidation. And so we cannot lose sight of that. So the frameworks enacted in Jamaica, Grenada, the Bahamas, I think Barbados is also pursuing. We need to see those entrenched across our member countries. They are important. What have we learned in this period? The countries with fiscal buffers have generally fared better, relatively speaking, than those without. They've been able to draw on their buffers to provide care and relief packages, and they've also been able to draw down on international resources on the basis of their fiscal fundamentals. So there's a reward for fiscal prudence and fiscal resilience, and that must not be understated. And it also means, difficult as the pandemic has been on all our economies, bar none, that they will have to do perhaps a little less when we get back to consolidation than others that did nothing or had nothing, no buffers, did not have any buffers in place. So there's a lesson there for all of our member countries. Now, same with fiscal resilience, two other things very quickly. The climate resilience debt instruments, and Minister Cadell of Barbados spoke to that. Minister Bowen knows we piloted that in Grenada in 2014 and 2015. Now, at the time, we were focused on hurricanes. But the truth is that, we frame them and we think about climate resilient debt instruments because they can be earthquakes, they can be pandemics, they can be any shock. And we know our region is susceptible to these economic, climatic, or natural disasters. In the same way that our central banks, not just ECCB, but many of our central banks around this region, have worked with our banks, our licensees, to deliver loan deferral programs for our households and businesses. And those programs have been key shock absorbers in this period. That is the same disposition, the same rationale that needs to be applied to the embedding of these clauses in all sovereign debt contracts, and certainly for all of our member countries. And we've piloted work on this with the World Bank and the IMF. Canada has been very supportive through the G7. And in 2018, we were able to get the International Capital Markets Association to put out a term sheet. I'm now very pleased to see that IDB has taken it a step further and is now offering that instrument as part of its toolkit. CDB, you're next, I hope. And I also want to see the World Bank and the IMF move in that direction. You have to provide that leadership. Clearly, we are asking the Paris Club to do the same. So those are in terms of fiscal resilience, that is very, very, very important. Minister Clark mentioned CRIF and the financial resilience, and I think we need to continue to scale that up. Let me move on quickly. Digital transformation, much has been said. So all I would add is that we are seeing very clearly, whether it is online education, remote work, which is a diversification around tourism that we are now exploring in Barbados and in Antigua and in other countries. This is important. Agribusiness. It is the game changer for all sectors of our economy. And therefore, we have to pursue digital transformation. Skills revolution. Minister Cadell touched that, and I will not add anything to it. Time will not permit. But we have to focus on skills. So one of the things our central bank does, for example, is that we have provided scholarships every year for 2 persons in STEM. We've also launched an internship program, Bright Sparks, where we take some of our best young people coming out of our state colleges. So this is 18-year-olds, they A-levels, about to go into university. Bring them into the central bank, work in an IT environment, let them loose, let them express themselves, but also prepare them to then go on to university with that work experience. The truth is we've had most of all of them actually, and they will go off when they want to, but we've kept them. They've been good and we need them because of course, this is a big area for our bank in terms of our IT services, cybersecurity and the whole works. Support for small businesses. Every large business started small. And I see Senator Webion, who is a master businessman in this region, a captain of industry. He understands that every large business started small. 50% of, at least 50% of all jobs in our region are generated by our small businesses. They have taken a battering, a beating in this pandemic, and they need support. So the whole support mechanism around small businesses, whether it's incubators, special credit access scheme, export credit guarantee scheme, the whole range of the suites, we have to really shepherd them now and ensure that they survive and obviously with technology, hopefully thrive. Very quickly, and I'll stop. Primary healthcare investment. I don't need to say a lot except to say the pandemic has exposed our vulnerabilities. NCDs, 78% of all deaths in this region are based on NCDs. And all the pandemic has done is just rip the plaster off of it and stripped it bare for all of us to see. And in a difficult environment, fiscally speaking, we have to deploy our resources to get the best or biggest bang for our buck. Every Minister of Finance has to figure out what he is going to do or she with that $1. And if we have to make a choice, I know we have to do some secondary and tertiary care, but our best bang is in primary health care. 2 more and I'm done. Food and nutrition. And that's tied to what we're talking about in health in primary health care. I want to see a moment in the region where we begin to go back to the discussion we were having in 2008, the Jaguar initiative about food and nutrition security in our region. What happened then was once food prices fell and the immediate pain eased, we abandoned the regional effort. That was a major mistake. And I'm hoping on this occasion, we do not repeat that mistake. This is a moment for us. And all of these things are about not just growth, but they're about resilience as a region, which is critical to our ability to not just survive, but ultimately avoid the start and stop in the boom and the bust, to be able to maintain a higher level of trajectory and to sustain. And the final one, Minister Bowen mentioned it, the renewable energy transition. So those, for me, those 7 would be my, very quickly, fiscal resilience, digital transformation, skills revolution, support for small businesses, enhancement of primary health care, food and nutrition security, and the accelerated transition to renewable energy. Those are my top 7 policy priorities. I'm going to stop there. I'm out of time.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor Antoine. We have taken note of your perspectives and your challenge. Mr. Mansour, you are a past financial secretary of Mauritius, a small country that has been growing at an average rate of 4% per year in real terms over the last 2 decades. Interestingly, this is twice the average rate of growth among CDB foreign member countries. And this growth has been based on diversified export growth. You also have experience at the World Bank and the IMF, and that gives you a broader perspective. I know you advocate for reforms in African countries. Tell us about some of the steps that Mauritius and perhaps other SIDS, other than Caribbean SIDS, have been taking in recent times with respect to creating competitive economies that allow their companies to access global markets. And of course, if you wish, you can home in on the whole issue of digitalization. Mr. Mansour.
Thank you very much, and good morning to the honorable ministers and the governors and all the people listening online. First, I want to say that it's very encouraging to hear from the honorable ministers that they are on top of the problem. And I think that we got more details from Minister Clark, Jamaica, but from what we heard from the other ministers, I would imagine that they are following a similar transformation path. So the first thing is, it seems like it's just a question of implementation and seeing through what is already on the table. I would like to offer some thoughts, however, to give context and to see where and how digitalization can indeed be crucial, as I think several people, including Governor Antoine, have said, for going forward. I also would like to sort of take what Governor Antoine said, and we should keep that in mind, that this is the great leveler. Lee Kuan Yew said that air conditioning was the great leveler in an earlier era, which allowed the tropics to develop. I think digitalization, as Governor Antoine said, is what is going to allow small economies across the world to compete. But let's go back then to comparative advantage. The economies in the Caribbean, as well as Mauritius and other Commonwealth small states, don't have large markets, they don't have a large population. Human capital is respectable, but not fantastic. The natural resources in many are limited. Some, like Trinidad and Tobago, may be more fortunate, but in general, there isn't a big natural resource base. So where's the comparative advantage? And I would argue, and I think this has been hinted at, particularly by Minister Clark, but also by his colleagues, that the real comparative advantage is good governance. And a lot of the things which were detailed by Minister Clark were to do with improving governance, and several of his colleagues also made the same point, that a lot of the reforms before the pandemic were in that direction, and the pandemic has just brought forth the urgency of doing it. So I think the central idea that perhaps we need to retain is, how are we going to use technology to improve governance? And many of the things which were said already suggest that this is already being done, but perhaps a better communication to the public. Maybe this is already being done, because I don't know what is happening in your region, But I think in many countries things happen, but there isn't a good communication with the public. I will also refer to the SDGs, which emphasize, amongst other things, the importance of involving civil society. We're dealing with complicated issues which do affect civil society, by which I include not only the business community, but also other stakeholders. And they need to have a voice in getting the government services delivered in a way that really is most effective. But there is one other point I want to sort of bring in, which was not discussed today. If we look at the most successful countries in the world, and whether it's small countries like Singapore or large countries like Canada and Australia, what we find is there is a huge pool of talent. We heard of skills, and definitely we need to do more, and we need to use technology. And it's very encouraging, some of the partnerships which Grenada, for example, has put together with outside partners to be able to improve skills development, and again, using technology to do that. But in addition to that, drawing skills from what is now a global village is very crucial. Even if you look at big countries or important countries like the UK, 17% of the UK population is foreign born. I know in Mauritius it's only 2%, even though Mauritius has been more open to getting talent from abroad in recent years, but it's still very low. And I suspect, although I don't have the numbers, that in many of your economies that you may be at similar levels. Singapore has 40% foreign born, Dubai 83% foreign born. And while the UK is 17%, the City of London is closer to 40%. So what I think we really need to think about is improving governance using technology, being open to FDI, which is already the case, but then the good governance, technology, marketing is going to help to get the FDI. But the FDI today is not so much money. In the end, most of our countries, I think, can get financing from the World Bank, from the IMF, from the markets. It's really the talent which comes with the FDI, which is the key, and having systems which either give long-term guarantees for people to be able to stay. Mauritius, in the recent budget, for example, has said that not only will people who come to Mauritius to work have the right for their spouses and immediate family to also work, but it's going to give a 10-year resident permit to people who come in. But we should also be contemplating, and given our history, all of us as countries which have been built by immigration, although in the case of the Caribbean as well as Mauritius, it's not only immigration, it's immigration and slavery, but it's people coming from outside. Given our history, we may want to rethink the role of getting more people in from outside. I'm not going to sort of say more than this, because I think the other things I would have said have been said by everyone, and I'll just sort of tell you the story of two hawkers, one of whom was diligently saying toothpaste, toothbrushes, shavers, cream, soap, and a long list for 5 minutes, and the guy on the other side of the street just said, same here. So I'm just going to say same here to all the good points made by the very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mansour. Thank you. Thank you. I think two key takeaways are: one, the real comparative advantage is good governance, and progressive immigration policies are critical. Senator Webby, now let me turn to you. In the midst of a pandemic that resulted in declining output in many countries and difficulties for many companies, Grace Kennedy reported that it had its best financial performance in its 99-year history in 2020. And of course, we also know that Jamaica has been implementing reforms and upgrading infrastructure in the last 7 to 10 years that have pretty much made the country more competitive. Indeed, Jamaica is the highest ranking country among CDB's borrowing member countries on the World Bank's Doing Business Indicator ranking. So let me ask you, what are some of the reasons for Grace Kennedy's performance in 2020? And was there any relationship between that performance and the steps that Jamaica has been taking to improve competitiveness that could provide lessons for other countries?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Ian, and good morning to my fellow colleagues. You know, as I reflected on the seminar and I read the headlines, Reimagining the Caribbean in the wake of COVID-19, that said a lot to me. What it is saying that it is time for the Caribbean region, both the private sector and government, to make bold decisions, bold policy decisions, and of course, to execute on those decisions. I think that now is the time, and as we say, when there is a crisis, there is an opportunity. So from a private sector's point of view, colleagues, the private sector invests based on confidence in policies, confidence in how the various governments are managing the economy. And as you have seen from the consumer and private sector reports, the confidence in Jamaica is very high at this time. One of the things that I'd say is that we have been through, and this is, I'm speaking as a region, that we have been really through a debt crisis. I mean, when you look at Jamaica, we were on the brink of having a very difficult time, and we have brought that down to the 90s. And one of the things that our minister has signaled, certainly to the private sector, is that notwithstanding the need for additional expenditure because of the pandemic, we the government are going to be fiscal responsible in terms of going forward. And that sent a strong message in terms of policy to the private sector that we're not going to be reckless in terms of increasing debt. So that has given us, the private sector, some amount of confidence going forward. And that is very, very important. In terms of Grace Kennedy making investments, not only in Jamaica, but in the region. Let me also say, from a Grace Kennedy's point of view, and I think Governor Antoine mentioned it, and I have 4 quick points. The whole issue of food sustainability for the region, that was highlighted significantly in terms of the COVID-19 crisis and the various governments. And we need to unite as a Caribbean region to ensure that we invest in agriculture, agro-processing and manufacturing, and that we can be self-reliant on our region as one in terms of food. Colleagues, I just got a call last night from my head of logistics and purchasing that the freight rates out of China pre-COVID was 2,500 US per 20-foot container. This morning, it is now 15,000 US per container. So what we're talking about is a significant increase in food inflation. Every main supplier that Grace Kennedy has, and we are a world company, we have businesses in Canada, the USA, and UK, we have been seeing significant increases in basic food prices. And obviously, we're going to try and manage that well, but some amount of that must be passed on to the consumers. You know, I asked my purchaser how long they think that this kind of freight rates will last. And to my surprise, he actually said mid-2022. So, you know, we're going to have some headwinds as a region. So the first thing is that food sustainability. We need to support our farmers by providing them with low-cost financing. We need to try and create a system of crop insurance, which is going to be very important. And, you know, we have this mindset in the Caribbean that farming is for the small entrepreneur. Yes, it is, but we have created at Grace what we would describe as a mother farm, where we guarantee the purchasing of the produce by small farmers in our mother farm, and we supply them with financing, and we also supply them with agriculture. And I believe, we supply them with raw materials, seedlings, and I believe that's a model that we must use going forward. We also, as a policy, Ian and colleagues, need to strengthen tourism linkages. Yes, there's a concentration in the region, as said by the previous speakers, about tourism and our dependence, You heard Minister Clark speak about the fall off by 70%, which was a huge, huge blow to us in Jamaica. But when that industry is up, we need to ensure that the local producers in the region provide these hotels with their goods and services. You know, I have done some back of the envelope calculations, and that can have a significant impact on the GDP growth in any country, from a farming right through to the craft makers. I was very interested in what Ali Mansour said about governance. You know, as a private sector leader, I say in most meetings that I have when I meet with government officials anywhere in the region, that we need to roll in the red tape and roll out the red carpet for investors and for entrepreneurs. Roll in the red carpet, roll out the red carpet, roll in the red tape. And I think this is an opportune time with digitization, where we can eliminate a lot of the bureaucracy in government across the region if we have a comprehensive plan of transforming not only the public sector but the private sector digitally. Let me give you a story, and I have shared it with Minister Clark. Minister Clark mentioned that our remittances are up 23%, which is good. I can share with you in March of 2020, and Grace Kennedy, we are the largest remittance player in the region. We represent and partner with Western Union in 12 countries. In March 2020, our remittances were down by 30%. 30%. And I said to my team, we need to do something about that. We have always said that we need to digitize remittances and digital remittances and that. But guess what? The plan to do that was probably in mid-2021, and we brought it forward, putting all the resources with digital registration and invested in the information technology. Colleagues, by June of that year, our digital remittances were up 400%. And right now, as we speak, digital is growing at that rate, and we are, as Minister Clark said, and we are growing faster than the market. Remittances are up 23%, and our business is growing faster than that. The point that I'm making is that you have to prioritize in terms of this new world or the new norm post-COVID, and it is obvious that digitization is extremely important. I want to make one other point as it relates to digitization. We made a decision to invest very heavily in setting up our own digital factory, where we're going to be producing apps both for our food business and our financial services business, and this is for all over the world. Well, you know, I say to you that, you know, most of the staff that we have engaged to work with us in that digital factory is actually outside of the region. The skill sets is just not there. And I said to my team, that is unacceptable. So what we're doing, we're engaging with the University of West Indies to create a program that we can train young Caribbean nationals to have that skill set quickly, so Grace Kennedy and other private sector entities can engage them going forward. This is also an opportunity to think differently, and I think Prime Minister Motley was the first out the gates with that. I have a number of friends, business colleagues all over the world, Canada, USA, as far as the UK, and one even as far as Ghana, right? They're actually in Jamaica working. So the Caribbean has a special appeal, whether you're a tourist or you're a business executive, to come to the Caribbean and working. Minister Gregory Boyne is on, Minister Clark is on. Business people love the Caribbean. Can you imagine if we can create a policy initiative where you don't need any work permit, but you can come to Jamaica, you can come to Barbados, Trinidad, Guyana, and set up your desk? Because what is happening after COVID-19, your workplace is really boundaryless. You can work anywhere in the world. And I believe that can be a special initiative that we can use as a Caribbean nation to invite business people from all over the world to come and work in the region, and that would have a multiplier effect. Having said that, we need to ensure, Ian and colleagues, that the infrastructure the technology or the digital infrastructure is robust and is in place. Many of us have been in meetings and the internet freeze and we start to panic for a minute. So we need to ensure that throughout the region that we have a firm, robust, fast technology system going in place, and if necessary, additional investments should be made. My final point as a private sector leader, this is also the opportunity to create policies around the public sector, private sector partnership. There's a lot of confidence in Jamaica in terms of working with the government. And I say not only Jamaica, regionally, for Grace Kennedy, we are a pan-Caribbean company. And I think we need to have a forum, a debate in terms of how can the private sector and public sector work together. We recognize as a private sector that there are needs out there that governments cannot fulfill on their own unless they go out there and borrow. And we have already spoken about borrowing and the trouble that we can get ourselves in if we increase our debt with a GDP that is basically flat or declining. So we need to have and CDB can play a lead role in this, where how can we create a framework where the public sector and private sector can work together in terms of increasing sustainable growth throughout the region. So that is my my spin on it, colleagues. I think all the presentations basically, and as Ali Mansour said, at the risk of repeating what I've heard before, but I think all the ministers spoke to a number of issues which I've been echoing for a long time, and I thought the contributions were very good. One last point, and every opportunity I get, I say, colleagues, we need a system of a proper capital market for the region. I've been saying this for 15 years or more, that we need one stock exchange for the region. We have been relatively insular in doing that. We have formed hybrids of a regional exchange. I believe that capital in the Caribbean should be reside in one exchange, whether it's US dollars or some other currency. That can be also a game changer going forward, where we can allocate properly capital where we can get the best return. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I really appreciate being invited to give you the private sector position on this topic.
Thank you very much, Senator Webby. The anecdote you shared about commodity prices is really sobering, and these price increases are going to be coming at a time when the region has not yet recovered. So the social impacts could be telling. However, I am heartened by the fact that most of what we shared today was really about solutions that can be shared among us to foster growth across the region. This was a very interesting and stimulating discussion, and as much as I would like to go on, time does not permit us to do so. The objective of the webinar was to develop broad recommendations that can be developed into policy actions for building more resilient economies that are better able to weather global shocks. Our countries have been buffeted by the impacts of the pandemic, but as Governor Antoine said, with every setback, there's an opportunity. And the impact presents us with the opportunity to focus our efforts on what is needed to build resilience, so that when the next global shock affects us, the depth and intensity of the impact will be less than it was with COVID, or it has been with COVID, and the duration of recovery shorter. This discussion provided some interesting insights into what some of our countries can do to recover from the impacts of COVID and make themselves more resilient and competitive. And I really, really want to express my deepest gratitude on behalf of the bank to the presenters and to the panelists. Minister Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance and the Public Service in Jamaica, Minister Marsha Cattle, Minister for Economic Affairs and Public Investment in Barbados, Minister James Kwesi Thompson, Minister of State for Finance in the Bahamas, Minister Gregory Bowen, Minister of Finance, Economic Development, Physical Development and Energy in Grenada, Mr. Timothy Antoine, Governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, Mr. Ali Mansour, Chairman of the Board of Directors at Regional Multidisciplinary Center of Excellence, Senator Don Lilly, CEO of the Grace Kennedy Group based in Jamaica. And I also want to say thanks to the viewers for joining us. And I trust that you found the discussion as interesting as we did. Now, our next event is the President's Chat, which will be held on Tuesday, January the 22nd at 10 o'clock. And we look forward to you joining us for what promises to be a very exciting event. Once again, thank you.